Old Grognard says, let's look at the rules for dwarves in AD&D 2nd Edition's Dark Sun setting. Welcome back to Old Grognard Says. So far in our Dark Sun Rulesbook series, we have an intro that broadly covers the contents of the rulesbook, and another video that covers Chapter 1, which is on how to roll ability scores. Now I'm going to start on Chapter 2 and cover the different player character races. As much as possible, I'm going to cover them in the order that they appear in the book, and, well, dwarves appear first, so here we go. On page 5 of the rules book, it tells us, dwarves are short but extremely powerful. Athasian dwarves average 4.5 to 5 feet in height and tend to have a very large muscle mass. A full-grown dwarf weighs in the neighborhood of 200 pounds. Lives of hard work in the hot sun leave them with a rich tan and rugged, calloused hands and feet. Dwarves can live up to 250 years. Going with the physical description, here are the height, weight, and age table entries for Athasian dwarves. These are from page 28 of the rules book. Also listed are the racial ability score adjustments from page 3, along with the minimums and maximums for ability scores. And then over here we have the allowed classes and level limits. Before we move on from physical descriptions and appearance, dwarves in this setting are usually hairless and don't have beards. It doesn't say this in the rules book description, but I did find mention of this under the description for dwarf Athasian in the Monstrous Compendium Dark Sun Appendix 2. Back on page 5, the description for Athasian dwarves continues. A dwarf's chief love is toil. A dwarf is never happier than when there is a cause to work or a fight for something he can approach with stoic single-mindedness for weeks, months, years, or even decades at a time. Once a dwarf's mind is committed to a certain task, he'll only set it aside after a great deal of grumbling and coercion. The fulfillment he achieves upon completion of a lengthy, difficult task is what he strives for. After this, it goes on to explain that the task a dwarf is presently committed to is referred to as their focus, and this is what it has to say about it. A dwarf's focus must be a feat that requires at least a week to complete. Shorter-term goals cannot be considered a focus. While performing tasks directly related to their focus, a dwarf receives a +1 bonus on all saving throws and +2 to all proficiency rolls, or a 10% bonus to percentile rolls. It then goes on to say that this is part of a dwarf's psychology because those who die before completing their focus live out their afterlives as banshees in the wastes, haunting their unfinished works. The last part of the dwarf's description gives us some more role-playing advice for dwarf characters. An Athasian dwarf takes notice of other beings based upon his focus. If the other being is also actively committed to the dwarf's focus, the dwarf will consider them a sensible and dependable companion. If, however, the other being is vehemently opposed to the dwarf's focus, the two will be irrevocably at odds until one or the other is dead. There is very little room for compromise in the mind of a dwarf. Other than the focus, the only other ability it mentions dwarves having is that they are non-magical like it says in the PHB. It doesn't mention poison resistance or improvision. Now, some folks will say that since they don't have it in their description, they don't have these abilities. I don't agree with that, and this is why. If we look at the other Dark Sun PC races that also appear in the PHB, the rules explicitly tell us if they have an ability or not, and if they have an altered version of it. For example, it specifically tells us that elves don't have any special resistance to sleep and charm spells, and don't have any special ability to detect secret doors. It does tell us that they have improvision out to 60 feet, and an example of an altered ability is that they get +1 to hit with longbows and longswords, but only if they're made by members of their tribe. Elves aren't the only PC race written this way. This is how every player character race is written, except for dwarves. It also explains the pluses and minuses to ability scores for all of the player character races in their descriptions, with the exception of dwarves. In my mind, not mentioning these things is an oversight since the rest of the book isn't written this way. But we still have the question, do they have these abilities or not? And for that, we need to look at the monster description for Athasian Dwarves in the Monstrous Compendium Dark Sun Appendix 2. In the description, it tells us that Athasian Dwarves do indeed have 60-foot infravision and bonuses to saving throws versus poison and magic. It also mentions the thing where magic items malfunction. A house rule I like to use for this is that rather than having a flat 20% chance of malfunction, the player rolls a d20 and hopes to roll higher than whatever their constitution-based magical save bonus is. This way, the more anti-magic a character gets from their constitution, the higher chance they have of items malfunctioning. Otherwise, it works just like it says in the PHB. None of the other dwarven abilities, like bonuses to hit against certain enemies, giant fighting bonuses, or mining ability, are mentioned. So in my game, they do have infravision, con-based bonuses against poison and magic, and the chance of magic item malfunction, as described in the player's handbook. Whether or not you do things that way is up to you. I'm just explaining why I do things the way I do. There are a couple of other things to keep in mind with the Thasian dwarf characters. Dwarves have a base movement rate of 6. I couldn't find this in their description, but rather had to find this by looking at their overland movement points and then working backwards. Characters in Dark Sun spend a lot of time traveling overland, so when figuring if you allow dwarves to have infravision or con-based magic or poison save bonuses, keep in mind that they have the disadvantage of slow overland movement to help balance that out. The other thing I want to touch on is that dwarf characters will very often have constitution scores of 20 or more, due to their having a +2 to their constitution. This doesn't sound like a big deal, but let's look at Table 3 in the PHB to see what this does. So if we look at Table 3 Constitution, which is on page 15 of the PHB, and go down to 20 through 22, you'll notice on the right-hand side there's a column that says Regeneration. What this means is that a character with a 20 con gains 1 hit point every 6 turns, or in other words, every hour. Now, if you're coming from 5e or a more modern game, this may not seem like much, but remember, most of the time in this game, characters have a natural healing rate of 1 hit point per day. Being able to regenerate 24 or more hit points per day is a game changer. If you're the DM, this doesn't break the game or anything like that. I just figured I should give you a heads up because there's a good chance the regenerating dwarf with a ton of hit points will show up in your game. Anyways, that pretty much covers dwarves in AD&D 2nd Edition's Dark Sun setting. As always, if you have any questions, please ask in the comments. Thanks for watching. Space Elephant and I would like to wish you a wonderful rest of your day.